All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Hi. Hopefully everyone can see me in the virtual world. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Daria Farrow. Who am I? I am a physician in the sections of hospital medicine and clinical informatics, and here today representing the innovation ecosystem, which I will tell you a little bit about. It is our goal to facilitate innovation by preparing CHOP faculty and staff with opportunities to strengthen community, build connections, and increase capacity related to innovation and entrepreneurship. And this event today is part of our Learn and Connect series, where we're really aiming to build capacity through training, skill building, networking, and resource sharing opportunities at CHOP for all faculty and staff. It aligns with our academic entrepreneurship ebook and community to provide just-in-time learning resources. And we also work in conjunction with existing employee programs, and we'll hear from, I saw Zev Sunleaf, who joined on our call, so Office of Technology Transfer, Office of Entrepreneurship and Innovation. And I want to say a special thank you to Rachel McGarrigle, our Director of Education at University of Pennsylvania Perelman School of Medicine, and also in the ITMAT education program for helping to facilitate both the academic entrepreneurship book and today's session. Today's session does align with one of the chapters in the book on FDA device regulation, and we actually have one of the authors here to talk about it, so we're very excited. And I will introduce Dr. Van Batavia in a little bit more in just a second. But if you're interested in these types of events and education experiences, I just also want to promote our more intensive professional development course that we're offering in the fall called Academic Entrepreneurship Fundamentals. Applications are open now through August 23rd. It's free. It's going to be 7 Wednesday afternoons in the fall, starting in October. It's open to anyone in the CHOP Penn system wanting to increase their knowledge with skills related to academic entrepreneurship, things like problem solving, rapid prototyping, business acumen, regulatory and industry partnerships, and the things that come with those. You don't need to have any previous experience with academic entrepreneurship. You don't need to have any new project ideas, and we're going to have food at every session, and it's shaping up to be really fun. And one of our presenters today, Dr. Jason Van Batavia, will be involved. We're really excited to have Jason present today. He is a pediatric urologist here at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, amongst many hats. He did his undergraduate degree at Yale, and then med school and residency at Columbia University in New York City, and then came to Children's Hospital of Philadelphia for a fellowship. Since he's been here, he's been busy inventing. He has 2 patents filed by here at CHOP through the CHOP Technology Transfer Office. He's had device development supported by multiple funding streams, FDA, small business awards, device consortiums, and then the American Academy of Pediatrics. He also is a member of the CHOP Institutional Review Board, so also helps to evaluate and understand these processes as they relate to regulatory requirements within our internal environment. And then within the University of Pennsylvania education program, he has completed a Master of Science in Translational Research, specifically focused on the entrepreneurial science concentration. So without further ado, I will flash up today's learning objectives, which is about medical devices and their classification, and talk about some of the FDA regulatory pathways, and turn it over to Jason. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Daria. Thank you for that very nice introduction. That guy sounds great. So I just want to, first off, thank Rachel, like Gary said, for helping out with all these slides and everything. It was a lot of back and forth meetings, so thank you, Rachel. I think we got a nice set of slides here that hopefully, if you guys have any comments on too, you can give us feedback at the end. We'd love that. We went over this already. One thing I would say is the IRB wants you guys to succeed with your medical devices, especially at CHOP. So if you have any questions or concerns, always talk to them early on. I know sometimes this seems like a pretty big hurdle, but they want you to succeed and get your studies approved. I got involved in medical devices through the MTR program at ITMAT. My device was on urinary flow, recording urinary flow in a home and office setting. And really from there, it started out kind of small, working in the lab, making some really just very rudimentary sort of prototypes. And then from there, we got that FDA grant for the Pediatric Medical Device Consortium. So that was like the starter. There are lots of opportunities out there to get your devices from the concept up. So take advantage of them, because it was really that started kind of the ball that went rolling down towards phase 2 SBIR grant from the NIH, which now hopefully we're going to get funding for the second part of that, which is a pretty substantial amount. So that'll be really helpful to move that device forward. We've done a couple of clinical trials, first in patients on 2 devices so far. So I'm really excited about all that. But today we're going to talk a little bit about defining a medical device, or at least what the FDA considers a medical device. We're going to talk about differentiating devices by classification, which is really important when you start to think about the regulatory pathway you're going to have to go down with your device. And then we're actually going to skip, I think, the 4th thing, which was an activity that was mostly more for in-person. So we'll probably not do that part, but definitely read the textbook, and it's a great resource. Understanding sort of the FDA regulation is really essential for all innovators, because if you're trying to bring an idea or product forward, you need to think about not only what steps you're going to need to get there, but the amount of fundraising you might need to do, the hurdles you're going to pass, the clinical studies you might need to make and to accomplish before you can get to your device to the market. Brief history sort of about the FDA. It was really started in 1906 with the passage of the Pure Food and Drugs Act by Congress. There were several health scares in the 1930s, including many deaths of children from a wonder drug called the elixir sulfanylamide. And after that, Congress passed what we know as the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, of the FDA, in 1938. This increased the regulation of drugs before they go to market. Prior, there wasn't a lot of oversight and regulatory. Medical devices, though, interestingly, were also part of that, but really only to monitor devices that were in the market already. So initially, it was really just looking at safety, efficacy, and proper labeling of devices on the market. That all changed in the 1970s after the Dawkins Shields intrauterine device catastrophe, where thousands and thousands of women had complications, miscarriages, infections, and even 4 deaths from that intrauterine device, IUD. So in 1976, Congress passed the Medical Device Amendment that leads us to the basis of our regulatory rules today. Interestingly, the Shields was manufactured by A.H. Robbins Company, and it was used by over 2.8 million women, and hundreds of thousands of lawsuits were filed. It was the largest tort liability case in the U.S. since asbestos when it happened. So that's why it's important to know about medical device regulation. So step 1. So when you're thinking about a device, your first step really is to say, do you have a medical device? And it's not always as easy as it sounds. And so when we think about this, there's 2 main things we have to think about. One is defining the intended use of the product that we have. So what is the general function of that device? The second is, what are the indications of use of that product? So we'll go over this again in the exact definition of the FDA, but really think about diagnosing, treating, preventing, curing, or mitigating disease as the intended uses for the device. So how does the device function, and what claims are we intending to make? So really you want to clearly state the purpose and the function and the intended patient population. So the FDA defines a medical device in the United States as, I think about this as like a what, why, who, and how. Daria, you kind of helped us think about this in this way, which I think is a really nice way to think about it. So the what is, it's an instrument, an apparatus, an implement, a machine, a contrivance, implant, in vitro reagent, or other similar or related article, including a component part or accessory, which is, and then the why. So A, intended for use, again, in the diagnosis of disease or other conditions that are, or in the cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease. Again, so that intent, think about that intent. Or the B part of this is if it's intended to affect the structure or any function of the body. And then the who is in man or actually other animals is how the FDA does define it. And then the how is that it achieves this function not through a chemical action within the body, and then not depending on being metabolized for the achievement of its main primary purpose. So if you have 2 knots there and then you fulfill A or B, then you're a medical device. The complexity of this still ranges drastically. So tongue depressors are medical devices, bedpans technically are medical devices, pacemakers, artificial pancreas systems, and then medical mobile devices now is getting into the realm of medical devices. So we're going to do a little fun activity first. So which product is a medical device? An adult diaper or an infant diaper or both? So again, we have to think about that intended use. These slides are FDA from the FDA too. They have a similar fun game on their website. So adult diaper is intended to protect an adult's garment from urine or stool, and an infant diaper is also intended to protect an infant's garment from urine or stool. So what does anyone in the audience think about this?
Not a medical device.
It's not a medical device. So if we think further about the intended use, in the adult diaper, it's intended to protect an incontinent adult. So when we think about it in that way, incontinence as a disease, entity, or condition, whereas in an infant, incontinence is sort of just the natural history and sort of generally what they do. Then now when we further define this use, does it fit under a medical device, you think? Anyone? Got some head nods. So we can go to this nice chart. So you can use this chart for any device that you're thinking about. But the first question is intended to cure, mitigate, or treat. So in the mitigate or treat incontinence, I would say yes, it is for the adult diaper, but not for the infant, because again, it's not a disease that it's treating. But incontinence here is the disease for the adult. Is it affecting the structure? No, the answer there is no. And then does it achieve its primary intention by chemical action or be metabolized? So no. So if you have a yes and then two no's or a no in the bottom one, then you're in that category of medical device. It's kind of weird. Yeah, not something that you'd think of as being regulated by the FDA. So you might still be confused, as sometimes I am for sure. And so there are a lot of resources out there. I saw some friendly face names on the list of people watching from afar, and Zev and Kelsey, I think I saw on there as well. Both helped me out really early on with my device and thinking about tech transfer, IP, and if I had a device and sort of what category it would be. So definitely reach out. That's the Office of Entrepreneurial Innovation and Entrepreneurship. They're really helpful. There's actually an ID office at CHOP. There's a medical device committee at CHOP that's independent of the IRB. And there's the IRB. So there's a lot of resources if you have a question about what your device is or how to get it into a clinical study. You can also ask the FDA. So the FDA allows you to request for designation on their website through an application process. And then you tell them what you think it is. I think this is a medical device, or I think it's not a medical device. They'll review it, and then they'll make a final determination in 60 days after filing. What's interesting here, too, and important is that sometimes you have a combination device. I'm not going to talk too much about that, but you can have a device. The FDA regulates three main things. You have your drugs, your devices, and your biologics, and you can have combinations. So a drug-eluting stent is a good example of one. So you may not know which, in different areas of the FDA, regulate each of those different categories. And so depending on which function is actually the most dominant, that it'll go to that center. So the FDA can help you determine which center it might go to your device. So definitely important to get in touch with them early and to use them and their resources, because you don't want to start the process one way and then realize you didn't have a device to begin with, which would be nice to know in the beginning, or you all of a sudden do have a device. So what about software? We're going to talk a little bit about software. Software is confusing, and it's constantly being updated. So a lot of these rules change every couple of years. But software functions that meet the definition of device, as we already reviewed, can include mobile applications or software that controls a hardware device. The FDA looks at these as two categories. So devices that are software functions can be a software as a medical device, or a SAMD, or a software in a medical device. And then here, really the important thing is that the functionality of that software has to pose a risk to patient safety if the software doesn't function as intended. So if you have a device that is regulating a pacemaker and that was to malfunction, that app, then that's a device, because again, the functionality there. If you have something that's monitoring, your calorie intake, that's not considered a device, because if it doesn't work, then it's not that big of a deal. And so it's sort of thinking about that as how it poses a risk to patient safety. Mobile medical devices, or MMAs, are obviously more and more common these days as well. So this is also an area that's can be a little confusing, and the FDA even recognizes this. And on their website, it literally says, email us early on in your software development process so we can tell you if it is a device, the level of risk, and whether or not you need a pre-market application. These can include medical devices that are mobile apps. They can include apps that incorporate device software that makes the phone into a device, or things that are connected to other devices that are using apps running on the devices. So again, if you have any questions about those, really best probably to ask early on. So now that we determined if we have a medical device or not, our second step in thinking about this is then to determine what classification our device is. And the FDA recognizes 3 levels of classification, and that'll help determine our regulatory pathway. So it's really important to identify these early and have proper identification of your new device, because it'll determine your pathway that you're going to go down, and that in many ways determines the time and cost that you're going to need to get your device from a concept to approval. And again, to help with this process, the FDA has research databases. They have a product classification database. You can search for similar products to what you're thinking of, and you can see if they exist, and if they do, if they've already been registered with the FDA, and then what level of class those devices are. So for instance, let's go back to our example of the adult diaper. So if we, hopefully this will run, if we go to the FDA's product classification and we write in incontinence here, it'll bring us to this garment protective for incontinence, and we can see that it is registered and that it is a class 1 device. So there's a registration number up here. Oh, here we go. I can read it up here. So we have a registration number, and then see this device class as 1. So this is a type 1, this is a class 1 device, and that's again important. And right above it, there's a little thing that says 510K exempt. So that's also important to see, and we're going to get into now what those mean and why that's important. But you can do this for any device that you have or any idea you have. So you can see if something exists. Bedwetting alarms in pediatric urology are common. They're class 2 devices, interesting, but they're exempt as well. Why do we care about classification? As we talked about, FDA regulation really hinges on the classification and the level of risk of your device. So in the US, the medical devices are classified in 3 groups. This is all based on potential risk to patients, and it determines your FDA pathway for the most part. It's not 100% stringent, but for the most part, it will help you understand your pathway and what sort of preclinical and clinical studies you may need to support it. And again, early understanding is important. These processes take time, lots of time, and lots of money. And we'll talk a little bit about the average amount of money for various different pathways. And you'll see why, again, you don't want to be thinking you're a class 2 if you're really a class 1, because that could be a big, tens of millions of dollar difference in terms of funding that you'll need. So class 1 are considered low risk. These are minimal potential to harm a patient, and they often have a long history of clinical safety and effectiveness. Examples here are surface electrodes, Band-Aids, gloves, some surgical instruments. Class 2 poses a moderate risk, so they're often, but not always, non-invasive, have more complex designs than class 1, and they must demonstrate that they can perform as expected without harming patients prior to use. Here, surgical sutures are important. Obviously, if your suture breaks off or a piece of metal breaks off in a body, that can be important, so that's why it's a class 2. CT scanners. So interestingly, medical devices also encompasses a lot of our radiology equipment. This is actually the Center for Radiology as well. And so any radiology equipment falls under these categories. And then guide wires and angiocath catheters are also considered class 2. Class 3, again, are the most high risk, and oftentimes they're used or capable of supporting or sustaining human life. They have substantial importance in preventing or impairment of human health, or there are new devices or technologies that have the potential for high risk or harm, such as implantable spinal cord stimulators, heart valves, pacemakers. So these also don't have predicate devices, and we'll talk about that a little bit too. So these are often kind of unique devices for which there are not other examples. So once you know your class, then it leads you towards thinking about your regulatory pathway. So before you can market any device and start selling it in the United States, you need to know if the FDA needs to approve of that device. So there are 3 ways to get to FDA approval so that you can then legally market your device. The first is an exempt device. This is also called 510K exempt. So those are kind of used interchangeably on the website of the FDA. It's under 510K exempt. So when we saw that for the incontinence diaper, it was 510K exempt. So these do not require FDA clearance prior to market entry. So you don't need to alert the FDA, hey, I have a new adult diaper, I'm going to start selling. Here's all my data showing that it works. As long as it's, again, in that class 1, majority of those, 75% of those will qualify as exempt. For class 2 devices, about 10% will qualify for exempt status. Bedwetting alarm, I think, or a Euroflow device actually is class 2, but it's 510K exempt, which is nice because it doesn't contact the patient, and so it doesn't require any sort of clearance prior. And they don't require any proof of the safety or efficacy. Again, doesn't mean you can go out and just sell a product that doesn't work or that is dangerous. There are controls that you need to have in place, and we'll talk about those as well. So even a class 1 exempt device has FDA oversight in the terms of general controls that we'll talk about. But it's a quicker pathway, obviously, than going the rest of the route. 510K or pre-market notification. This includes a de novo pathway we'll talk a little bit about, but basically this is for the majority of our class 2 devices. Some class 1 devices too will fall under this. And these require that you have some data showing that your lease is safe and effective as a device already in the market. So these are what's called based on a predicate device. So essentially you're saying you have a device that's similar to another device being used that's already been shown to be safe and effectiveness, and you're close enough to that and you have some preliminary data showing it's safe that you can go to market without having to do like a randomized controlled trial or some more extensive safety studies. This is important because again, you have to base it off another device. The de novo pathway is if you have a device that has no similar device that's out there, but it's not a high-risk class 3 device. So that would require a lot more legwork to get through because you have to show safety and efficacy because there's nothing similar to your device. But it's a little bit faster than going the third route, which is the pre-market approval or PMA. And this is the strictest pathway. This is for all class 3s. Essentially, some class 2s will fall into this category as well. And this is the most stringent, again, pathway. If there's no existing predicate, or even if there is an existing predicate, you still have to go through this pathway. It requires contact with the FDA pretty early in the process. You need to have scientific data, regulatory quality systems. This is all approved. And so, again, it takes a longer path. And we'll talk a little bit about costs and pathways in these pathways and how long it takes in general. But from concept to an FDA or PMA approval can take as long as 3, 4, 5 years. So it can take a while. There is a fourth option we won't talk about too much today, but that's the humanitarian device exemption. So this is for rare disease, which is defined as less than 4,000 patients a year with that disease. So if you have a rare disease and have an idea for a device for that, you can get through with this pathway, which is obviously a little bit less stringent than the others, but is important because otherwise you wouldn't really want to make a device for 50 or 100 or 200 or 1,000 people because no medical device company would support you in that because there's no money for them eventually in the end. So this is a quicker way to get through and a way to hopefully support the use of developing devices for diseases that don't have as many patients. So again, looking at this as the classes, so class 1, we talked about with the low risk, so this is exempt, 510 exempt. Class 2, again, the 510K clearance is the most common way to get through FDA for this. They require that predicate device, as we mentioned. And it's important when we think about a predicate device that substantial equivalence is defined by the FDA as having the same intended use as the predicate and the same technological characteristics, or the same intended use but different technological characteristics, but doesn't raise new safety or efficacy concerns. So you can have slight variations. And so sometimes if you have a new device, getting a couple sort of 510K clearances that change the device slightly to get you your final could be a faster and cheaper route than going through the PMA for a new one or a de novo 510K. So there are ways in regulatory strategy that you can think about those. There's a great chapter on regulatory strategy in the textbook as well. But so for a 510K, you submit an application. The company, you or the company or whoever the inventors are going to submit an application to the FDA. You're introducing this device, again, telling what you're changing from predicates and basically asking them to go down this 510K route. Now, the FDA can always say that it doesn't satisfy these requirements, and then they can put you into a PMA. So the time frame, though, so for a 510K submission, the FDA has 90 days to get back to you on that submission. And they say they met this about 95% of the time in the last calendar year. But that 90 days, there's going to be a lot of back and forth. So just as they respond to you and ask for more questions, they can get another 90 days and so on. So it doesn't mean that from when you submit your application, you'll be approved by 90 days. And again, we talked a little about the de novo pathway, and that's for devices that don't have a predicate but don't have the high risk associated with the class 3. So again, class 3, those are the higher risk, the heart valves, the stents. These are going to go through the pre-market approval pathway or PMA. Now, interestingly, what do you guys think? How many devices or how many applications of the FDA each year are class 2 compared to class 3? What percentage, I guess, are class 3, do you think? 20%, heard. About 2%. So it's a lot less. In 2016, there were 71 PMA submissions compared to over 3,000 510K submissions. But this is actually, it's increasing kind of year by year, so that might be a little more. But it is the strictest pathway. Again, there are no predicate devices, or even if there is a predicate device in a class 3 level, you still have to go through this process, because just because I invented a new heart valve doesn't mean the FDA is going to let me start selling it because it's a predicate device. I need to show that it's safe and it has the same efficacy. So these often require pivotal studies, large randomized controlled trials. These studies are long. They take a lot of money and cost to design. But what's important to remember as an innovator is while the PMA process is laborious and costly, your device can't be used as a predicate for another device. So if you get through that pathway, then you actually have a little leg up on the competition, because they can't use you as a class 2. Someone could use you and then make a similar device. So the classic sort of thing in urology, or actually in surgeon general, is the Da Vinci robot, right? So the Da Vinci robot went through class 3, and there are a bunch of other robots that are sort of out there, but none have really gotten as far along because the Da Vinci had sort of that leg up on everybody. And by the time everybody started using these devices, everybody got comfortable with their machine. And so I think Google has one now, and Johnson, there's another one that's out there, but they're rare to find institutions that are using them, because everyone sort of got grabbed onto the innovative, Intuitive, or is it? Intuitive is the company, but Da Vinci is the robot. We have one. They're $2 to $4 million, I think. So just something that protects you a little bit when you think about entrepreneurship. You get some protection there from your PMA. The PMA pathway, the FDA says they get 180 days time frame before they will have to respond to you. And if they respond to you with questions and then you answer the questions, they get another 180 days. So that process can go back and forth. They claim on their website that the average time is about 330 days when you hear. But we'll talk about a study that was done recently, or not recently, I guess a few years ago, that suggested that was a lot longer than just 330 days. So in terms of the classes, we talked a little bit already about this, but the reason, again, we think about this is in terms of how manufacturing can be done. So general controls apply to all classes. So if you're a class 1, you're exempt from FDA notification. You still have to think about how you're going to manufacture that company. You have to register with the FDA your device. You have to make sure that the labeling is correct, and then you have to make sure that all your manufacturing is done and in place that's in accordance with good manufacturing practices. So it's not like you can just go make this at your house and then start selling it on Amazon. You still need to make sure that you are complying with these general controls, even Band-Aids in class 1s. And there's quality system regulations that are required as well. For those that fit into the class 2 and class 3, or the 510K pre-market clearance and the pre-market approval, the FDA requires a special set of requirements called special controls. And now these are usually device specific, so there's not just one set of special controls, but they can involve patient registries, so keeping track of all patients who have used the devices, all the safety, all the effectiveness data, performance standards. They may also involve post-market surveillance. We'll talk a little bit about that at the very end. So there's a lot of other things that you may have to think about for those class 2 and class 3s. So how much does this cost? So the FDA doesn't just do this for free. The FDA has a list that comes out every year of their annual fees, or the medical device user fee amendments. And so for the 510K process, if you want to submit an application to the FDA, to submit that, you need to submit $19,870. Or if you're a small business, which I think is defined as a less than 50 or 30 people and less than 30 million annual revenue a year, you can get a discounted rate of about $5,000. But for the PMA, it's $441,000 just to submit your PMA application. And then again, a little bit more discounted for small business. There are also annual fees. So if you have a class 3 and you need to keep reporting the safety, they're going to charge you about 15 grand a year. And again, this is because there are a lot of people at the FDA looking over all your applications and making sure it's safe. So I'm not trying to say this is they're stealing money. It's a lot of long process and a lot of manpower and wind power to get these applications through and make sure it's safe and can be used. So interestingly, so those are the fees that we see here. But how much do you think it costs, start to finish? You have a concept, and now got a 510K approval. So again, it's a class 2. We'll say the class 2 concept on paper to 510K approval. How much money do you think you as a company need to spend to get to that route on average?
15,000.
15,000?
3 million.
3 million. Anyone win Powerball on the Mega Millions last night? I did not. But it's on average, it was 31 million. This is like 5 years ago too, so it's probably more than that. This is pre-COVID numbers. And 77% of that money went towards FDA regulation pathway, whether it's studies. The fees aren't exactly that high, but it's really the studies and all the stuff you have to do to get to the studies. The time, hiring consultants and doing everything, about 31 million. And the time from filing, again, they said it was 90 days to approval. On average, it was about 10 months. But when you start talking to the FDA, and one thing, we're going to talk about a little bit is talk to the FDA early and often. And so from the first communication to the FDA to actual approval, it's more like 31 months on average when you looked at it. For PMA, so who wants to take a guess on PMA costs, concepts? It's 100 million. I thought I heard someone say it.
Yeah.
100 million. It's about 100 million.
A lot less than a drug.
Yeah, that's true. So 100 million, 75%, again, going towards steps related to FDA regulation. And then the mean first communication to approval here in the study was 54 months. So definitely a lot longer than the 180 days that the website says. But again, that's a lot of, that's just communication. That's not necessarily when you're submitting your application. But there's some exemptions, and this is important to know, especially at CHOP and if you're in pediatrics. So if you have a small business, you have a waive there. Actually, will waive the first time you submit a PMA. So again, that it was 100 something, right? $110,000 fee there. They will waive that for a small business with less than 30 million in sales for their first PMA application. But pediatrics, actually, they waive all fees. So if you have a pediatric solely for pediatric use device, it's important to look at it solely for pediatric use device. So not a device that can go both ways to adults and for pediatrics. It has to be solely pediatrics. They will waive all the fees. So even if you're doing a PMA process. So they're trying to get you to make medical devices for pediatrics, right? There's a dearth of that, and obviously there's a need for pediatric medical devices. And so there's an incentive there from the FDA. Now, if you get it approved and then you start selling it in adults or want to sell in adults, you will have to go back and pay that fee. So it really is solely for pediatric use. But something that is important to know. May be helpful. So going again back to software for a second. The FDA first published guidance on software functions in mobile medical devices in 2013. But it's constantly being updated almost about every 3-4 years. So it's always in flux. It's always changing. It's really complex. Even just trying to read up a little bit more about it for this talk, I was down wormholes and just rabbit holes and everything. So again, probably just worth talking to them early on. But again, these policies are independent of what platform. So any app, it doesn't matter if it's on a Samsung or an iPhone or an iPad or any sort of other device, as long as they're running on any software, they're considered the same sort of regulations process. And they think about risk actually as the same as they think about it for medical devices. So it's important that we just went through sort of all those classifications because they also think about risk in a similar way for software or apps. There's also a list of devices on their website too, which is helpful. So we're going to get into another activity, the Apple Watch. came out with an EKG app a few years back, and then there's a blood oxygen monitor as well. So, how do we think about these? Do we think about them as medical devices? They're apps on a watch, right? So they're considered sort of in that purview of being a software function. But let's talk about the blood oxygen monitor first. So blood oxygen monitors measure your pulse ox, right? So how much oxygenation you have. Do we think this fits the criteria for A? Is it intended to cure, mitigate, treat, or prevent a disease? So it depends on how you're marketing a little bit, right? So if you're saying, I'm going to tell you when you have COVID because your oxygenation levels go low, then perhaps. But what if we're just using this just to, I don't know, make sure that it's fun to see your oxygenation as you're running, and as we're doing exercise, we want to see, our numbers stay high. So it depends a little bit on the marketing here. So Apple and all those other devices that are out there are pretty smart. They don't claim that this treats a disease or cures anything, or prevents anything. So the answer there is actually no for blood oxygen level. Is it intended to affect the structure or any function of the body? The answer there is also no. And it doesn't use chemical action, or is not metabolized by the body. So there, it's actually a no. And so it actually fits under this general wellness category. So in 2016, the FDA, through the 21st Century's Cure Act, actually removed software functions from software functions that function solely as general wellness from their definition of medical devices. And this was probably because there were just so many out there, they just couldn't really regulate them, is my guess. But if your software app only is encouraging or maintaining a healthy lifestyle that's unrelated to diagnosis, cure, mitigation, prevention, or treatment of a disease or condition, it's no longer considered a device and not under FDA oversight. So that's why a lot of those like fitness apps and like tracking food and tracking your exercise aren't considered necessarily to be oversight by the FDA anymore. Now, again, if you're claiming you're going to improve somebody's diabetes by helping them eat less sugar, then you can get in some gray areas. Again, that's the rabbit holes you can jump down. But if you claim you're just a wellness app, then you might be able to get away with it. So what about the EKG or the ECG monitor on the iPhone?
Yes.
Yeah. So anyone know why?
Tells you.
AFib.
Yeah.
Exactly. So it specifically will tell you if you're an AFib or not, right? And so since that is a disease, you are now have a yes for intended to, I guess, not really curing, not really treating, but at least letting you know you have a disease, maybe preventing a stroke or clotting. So that is yes. And so the Apple Watch actually had to get a device classification. So then we can think about what classification do you think our device would be in?
Class 1.
Sorry, let me go next slide.
Class 1.
So pretty low risk.
Yeah. Especially if you can point to other devices.
Yeah. But what happens if it's wrong and you're actually an AFib and it tells you you're not?
I think it's 2. Yeah, I think 2.
Yeah.
We're voting for 2.
Yep. So it actually isn't 2, which I think it's a little tricky though, right? Because again, it's really non-invasive, but it's more of what it's trying to prevent and tell you that makes it. Again, it's the intent more so than the action. And so it is a class 2. So how about regulatory pathway? We learned about class 2. What's the most common pathway for class 2? 510K. What happens if there's no predicate device?
Okay.
Yeah.
So they need a PMA.
So they had to do the de novo. They went to the de novo 510K pathway. So that's for class 2s that are not necessarily at the high risk of a class 3. They'll let you go that way versus a PMA. Okay. So now what happens if I want to just ignore the FDA altogether? Okay. So say I have a device. It measures oxygenation, pulse, baby movements. It's in a sock. And it's just for general wellness, though, even though it's going to help prevent your baby's premature deaths from.
Yeah, direct to consumer.
Yeah, so they were selling this. So there's a company that was selling on Amazon and on their website. It's called Owlet. What do you guys think about that? So, obviously this company made a decision, right? They had this device. They went right to market. So they didn't talk to the FDA. They didn't tell them. How do you think the FDA
They weren't happy.
No,
That
they
sounds
were
like
not.
snake oil.
So when the FDA is not happy, they actually will send you letters. And they always will publish the letters online. So this is the FDA warning letter that came out to Owlet in 2021. And it basically said, we have learned that your firm is marketing Owlet Smart Socks in the United States without marketing clearance or approval in violation of the FDA Act. Under section, these products are devices because they're intended for use in the diagnosis or other conditions in the cure, mitigation, treatment, or preventive disease. So since 2016, the FDA has corresponded with Owlet that the Owlet Smart Sock meets the definition of device under the FDA Act and does not fall under the compliance policy for low-risk products that promote a healthy lifestyle, those general wellness guidance. So they were trying to go through the general wellness guidance from 2016, but the FDA caught them and told them they couldn't sell it anymore. So now, this was on their website most recently. They have now got FDA clearance for their newest monitor. It's not out yet, you can't buy it, but that'll be coming out soon. So probably that was quicker than I
Was
thought.
CHOP involved in that study, I think? Was
Oh, I don't know, were they?
We did not, I don't think we were involved in the FDA clear. There were a bunch of researchers and papers written because, as you pointed out, that this device was marketed and available for consumers for many years before anything has happened. And so I think, it just goes to show, just like it takes time to get FDA clearance, it can also take time for the FDA to kind of respond. I think that there were other direct to consumer marketed pulse oximeter monitoring type devices like this, but ultimately, it can take a long time, and I think it creates interesting conversations as a medical community when these devices are being consumed by patients and families in the wellness realm. And what is it?
And then they're talking to you, they're calling you up.
Yeah, they're in the emergency room and said the sock beeped and said the pulse ox was low. And what are we supposed to do with that? So.
Another interesting example we were just talking about was the SNOO. I don't know if anyone has used the SNOO. It's like a smart bassinet, like baby monitor for helping babies sleep, infants. Initially when it came out years ago, like it sort of said that it could help with infant death syndrome. There was like, they never had a case of it. So they never said it prevented it, but it was kind of like on the website, it was like, there's never been a case of sudden infant death syndrome in a patient and a baby using this device. So I always thought that was kind of interesting how they kind of said that, but again, they didn't go through FDA initially. But I just looked on their website, and they actually now do have FDA approval through a de novo FDA pathway that it does decrease the risk of sudden infant death syndrome. So that's kind of.
And so, I was just looking up here, and I see that they did pull the product from the market when they got the FDA warning letter. But to be kind of a little bit cynical, maybe this was a smart strategy on their part because they got 5 years of sales and research from the product without getting any penalty. I mean, if the FDA charged them with a multi-million-dollar penalty, that's one thing, but it kind of seems like a win for them because they got their product out there, they got some revenue,
Yeah.
they got some data. Why isn't this a bad strategy?
Good question. I mean, I think if there was harm that happened, though, then you're liable for that, right? So,
Yeah.
I mean, this obviously was not a very invasive device, but, like we talked a little bit about with when in-uterine devices first coming out and they were using them and women died and all those. So I think, it's a matter of that risk. So if the harm is low, you probably could get away with it, but I don't know.
Yeah, so it's interesting because they got FDA clearance for this BabySat system, and you can't help but wonder with some of the data they had from their, consumer data, was that helpful to feed it in? Because generating the revenue to do all that testing is expensive.
So they basically had the consumers do their fundraising. That was their first.
Yeah, so I kind of think the FDA should have penalties, not just a cease and desist letter, frankly.
I'm surprised that they don't consider that spoiled data.
That'd be interesting to see if
Yeah.
they're allowed to.
Yeah.
Because I know in other things, if you get caught doing it and it's illegal, you're not allowed to use that research and you have to distinguish all new research.
Yeah, so maybe they couldn't use the research, but at least they had revenue.
Safety data, I think you can probably use.
Yeah, they can use safety data. Yeah, it's kind of like a flaw in the system that the FDA isn't penalizing.
Yeah. That's a good question. And these letters are like kind of more and more common. And at our IRB meetings, we review a couple letters almost every month, it seems like, not for devices that we have, but just in general. because we think about this a lot when we're approving studies or looking at devices, because that's a whole talk for another time, but, if a device is a low risk or a non-significant risk device and it's class 1 or even a class 2, we will sometimes approve that in the study, whereas you don't need to go to the FDA initially, but again, talk for another time, but things that are important because, we don't want to say yes to something and then get a letter from the FDA too saying that we messed up. So you got approved, congratulations, you can market your device, you're done, right? Nope, not yet, because there are some other things you got to think about. We talked a little bit about post-market requirements, but for any 510K and PMA, you do have to think about sort of how you're going to monitor things after approval. This can include ongoing clinical studies, it can include registries of all patients with the device, safety monitoring, and reliability and efficacy of the device. So just because you got approval doesn't mean you're done with the FDA or with thinking about safety. The FDA also requires the manufacturers of any device to report any serious adverse events directly to them. There's a certain time frame that they have to do that. And then not only that, but actually federal regulations require that the hospitals, IRBs, providers, even users of devices report any patient incidents or adverse events to both the manufacturer and to the FDA. So every so often we'll get a serious adverse event that comes to us as a reportable event to the IRB, and we have to determine if this is serious enough that it requires FDA notification. And every so often it is, especially if it's a newer device or a lot of times it's more for the drugs and biologics, but for devices as well. There's one last pathway, so we have a couple more minutes. So if you have a device that's considered a breakthrough, there's actually a quicker pathway for you can consider. This was part of the newest, again, 21st Century Cure Act. And this breakthrough device program helps get devices and with breakthrough technologies to patients quicker. And so a breakthrough device has to be more effective in treating or diagnosing of a life-threatening or irreversibly debilitating disease and incorporates breakthrough technology. There cannot be another approved or clear alternative, or if there is, this device has to be significantly better than the other one. And the benefits of this program are that you communicate earlier with the FDA, there's some more flexibility in how you design and run your clinical studies, and there's expedited manufacturing inspections, but most importantly, priority review. So your application will go to the top sort of that pile of reviews, so you get reviewed quicker. So again, for life-threatening or irreversibly debilitating diseases, which we see a lot of, unfortunately, at CHOP, this is a potential pathway that will be a little quicker. So in summary, our goal was to understand how the FDA defines and classifies medical devices. Well, we start with two, maybe not so simple questions, but one, is my device is my product a medical device? So again, thinking about the intended use, the adult diaper versus the infant diaper. And then two, if I have a medical device, what class is it? And this again will help you think about this early, define sort of your pathway you want to go in terms of regulatory, how much money you might need, support you might need. And then ask questions often, ask them early, whether it's here at CHOP, at Penn, whether it's the FDA directly. There are a lot of resources, so you shouldn't have to struggle too hard, hopefully, with your thought process. If you have concerns, just reach out. CHOP, like the IRB, again, the medical device company or a committee I've talked to twice about devices that I'm thinking about, and he's super helpful. Richard Lynn, he's awesome. And then the IRB committee itself, you can always talk to if you're thinking about designing a study or you want to trial something. And then read more about it in the chapter. We have all three editors in the room right now. And so, oftentimes thinking about FDA regulation, medical devices, it may seem like a huge mountain to climb, like this mountain you see on the right here. This is Mount Baldy in New Mexico. It's part of the Philmont Scout Reservation. 3 weeks ago, I went with my son and 5 other scouts. We did a 2-week backpacking trip, and we saw this mountain as soon as we got there. And part of our itinerary was we were going to climb this 12,441-foot mountain. And so it's pretty daunting, just like the FDA maybe in their regulatory pathways. But we had a plan, we had some maps, we had some leaders who helped us out. And it took a little bit of time, but on day 11, we got to the top of that mountain. So